So in the planning stage for when we are going to recruit panelists, one thing you want to consider is the incentive. If you've ever been in a sensory evaluation test before, you may have been giving small tokens or snacks as incentives. So generally, this would depend on how much participation is required for of the panelists. Higher level participation means larger gifts or tokens. If they are employees of your organization, they must be given due recognition, maybe for promotion or whatnot, or it's part of their work hours. Or if it's a descriptive test, which usually takes multiple hours and multiple sessions, then this should involve some sort of part-time employment. While it's not uh, bad to give monetary incentives or something like gift checks, the incentives must always be commensurate to the level of participation required and not any larger. So it must not unduly bias them from giving more positive responses because of a gift of token of gratitude or utang na loob, a debt of gratitude rather. And at the same time, it mustn't be too menial that it's really a waste of their time. So because you are using human subjects, participation is entirely voluntary. You can't just force someone into a white van and tell them, hey, evaluate our product or we'll do this to you. And they should have legal capacity to give consent. So in which case, if you're using children as subjects, then you usually have parental consent, and the children should be willing to participate. If they're not willing, even if their parents have consent, then that's still a no. No means no. And then the subject should be able to exercise the power of choice regarding their participation, and they can actually we're actually required to tell them that they can quit at any time. For example, if the sample they're evaluating is something they found out they don't like, or they apparently found maybe an allergic reaction to it during the middle of the study, they can quit and we cannot force them to continue. They can drop out at any time. And generally, we should allow them to participate in studies that would yield fruitful results for the society. So, not something out of personal interest without any actual societal value. So in that regard, we also have consent forms that should be discussed later. So as sensory investigators, we should be for the panelists in terms of their rights and welfare protection. Therefore, part of our design must minimize any risks associated with the study, and that the benefits will greatly outweigh those risks. So it is also our duty to make sure what are the risks of the study. If you have a food with an allergen, will overconsumption lead to obesity, or maybe a food that can increase blood pressure. So we have to be transparent about those things and make them make an informed choice based on facts that we have. We also want to make sure that persons participating in the study um, have the right of adequate and informed consent. Okay, so we cannot force them or manipulate them into submission or participation, even if they're our friends. So this is an example of a consent form, as you can see here. There is information on what the study is about. Okay, and what information you're asking from them, the purpose of the research, and so on. There is also an issue of ethics in terms of consent. We have what we call an ethics review committee. So when you have an experimental design, usually before this was not really a thing, but now since sensory evaluation uses human subjects, stricter guidelines now state that all sensory evaluation tests must undergo an ethical review. In our case, the college is making an ethics review board or committee. And if you're going to have your thesis have sensory evaluation, then you would have to undergo ethics review. You submit your sensory evaluation plan, and they assess it and ask you to make the necessary revisions to make sure that the consumers or the participants are protected adequately. So food technologists would often say that amidst this issue of NPA recruitment, the only recruitment they've encountered in their stay in UP was this, being recruited as a panelist for sensory evaluation. So when you're going to recruit someone, make sure that they know what is expected of them. Don't hide anything. And it's actually a contractual relationship, so you should make them aware of what their duties and responsibilities are, such as that of course they could earn their rights as well, that they could terminate participation at any time, but that they must give truthful evaluations and not just give high marks because you're their friend and they don't want you to appear like you made such a substandard product. You make them aware of the time commitment. If you've done a dry run and the dry run works out to be 5 to 10 minutes per person, then tell them that. Okay, don't tell them that it'll only take a minute when in fact you're giving them 27 samples to evaluate for 10 parameters each. Then you should also tell them of what the incentive should be. So sometimes people are just silent and then they surprise the participants by handing something out as they go out the door. But again, the incentive should also be made clear so that if they ask what's in it for me, you're clear about what's in it for them. And then they should always sign a consent form as a proof of their voluntary participation. And as usual, the consent form should be designed in such a way as to be very truthful about their roles, responsibilities, and rights. So generally, there are screening criteria. If it's a consumer test, usually it's just whether or not they fit the bill as to what consumer demographic you are planning to test. For example, there might be an age range, or they should be from a certain location or a certain income demographic. At the same time, if you're doing tests requiring trained or semi-trained panelists, it usually requires having a certain score. So you have pre-screening tests like what you did with exercise 1. Okay, so those are screening tests for evaluating what kind of panel acuity you have. Right, so for example here, if you have a matching and description test, you would want someone who would score maybe above half on the taste and aroma identification. And for discrimination tests, so if you want to have a panelist trained for quality assurance or quality control to analyze samples to detect differences, then they must have a higher than average detection rate or correct response rate for the triangle and duotria test specific to the product. Then for ranking and rating tests, they should have 100% score on ranking. Let's say the intensity of taste solutions, or depending on your product, maybe a certain intensity of flavor or aroma. So in sensory evaluation, we have untrained panelists, semi-trained panelists, and the trained panelists. So it is of course dependent on their level of training. When you say untrained panelists, these are the walk-in consumers or recruited consumers typically used for mostly consumer tests, and they have absolutely zero relevant training. The semi-trained panelists are us, the ones who underwent sensory evaluation class and have knowledge of what it means to be a sensory evaluation analyst or sensory scientist. However, in terms of actual training specific to products, we don't have very specific training for specified number of sessions or hours. On the other hand, trained panelists are those who have been specifically trained for specific products for the participation in descriptive tests mostly. All right. So again, the amount or level of training is dependent on the task and level of acuity desired. So those things that we use for screening, the tests that we use, except for demographic screening, are actually assessments of panelist performance. So when you're doing descriptive tests for trying to use the human body as a meter of sorts for the intensity of flavors, aromas, or any sensory sensations, then you need panelist performance assessment, which is simply, in one sense, comparing the score of the panelist with the mean score of the whole panel. So it's a relativistic point of view. If the whole panel sucks, then even having a mean score would mean that it's still a sucky score overall. But generally, if you have screened panelists, then their performance would be way better than the average person's at the very least. So for analytical tests like descriptive sensory evaluation, it's expected that you are in good health and good physical condition, especially with COVID-19. We don't want anyone who can't smell or taste anything to be part of the study. Of course, you must not be fatigued or stressed, or you must not lack sleep because this would affect your response. If you're a smoker, refrain from smoking at least 30 minutes before the test. Otherwise, refuse participation. And then refrain from eating 2 hours prior to the test if you are participating, because if you are still a bit full, then you might give different responses. Other than smoking, chewing gum, drinking coffee, or brushing your teeth should not be done 1 hour prior to the test for obvious reasons. And those who are pregnant or have just given birth should not participate. Of course, for one, we would not want to risk the child they're carrying, and on the other hand, the hormonal imbalances may affect their responses. This is, of course, unless you're evaluating maybe food for pregnant women, but I think it would be a big ethical issue if you would want to do that. So one thing you must have is interest and motivation to participate as well. And therefore, although trained professionals, of course, will participate in anything, it would be demotivating if you were to give samples that they would not like. For example, there's a standard for testing chilies, and if you're not someone who is very tolerant of chilies, then you might want to give up in the middle of training because you're eating nothing but spicy stuff. I remember as a quality assurance analyst, one of my jobs was to taste everything delivered raw materials. Okay, so we're putting ourselves on the line. There are microbial tests, but we also taste test everything to make sure that there is no rancidity present in the nuts, for example. And one of the things I hated to do the most was tasting batches of cold coconut cream. Okay, they're delivered frozen, so you must eat them cold. And you usually deliver it in batches of like 5, 10, or 11. So you'd be fatigued. And who eats cold coconut cream anyway? It's not normal, right? But we need to do it as part of assuring that the taste of the raw materials going into our ice cream will be in conformance to whatever standard we have. That there are no off taste or off aromas or off flavors. And that was one part of my job that I did not like, that I take it anytime. If they delivered cashew nuts, they delivered those chocolate chips. This brings back memories. But again, as a professional, you must be motivated, whatever product is before you. Alright, so for analytical tests, usually we want the panelists to be available. That's why you're considering them as employees. If you're gonna require them to be present at specific times of the day and at specific days, then they have to be there at those times. So for example, you're evaluating the change in samples over time. That let's say you bake pandesal and you want to know that they change in texture after every 2 hours. So um, they would have to be there 2 hours after the product is baked and then 4 hours after and so on. Of course, you have to time that so that they will not be full by the time that they are going to evaluate. So those who will undergo training as panelists obviously should have a good memory in terms of the senses, so you could remember the taste, the aroma, the texture of the thing that you are evaluating, such that you can compare them from memory. You know how you could remember the taste of, let's say, Coke or a certain burger from a certain fast food chain, and you can elicit those memories. Like if you are to taste something, oh, this tastes like the burger I ate a week ago, or something like that. And then, of course, reasonable intelligence and common sense, because you are comparing samples, you are analyzing them. Um, Usually, when you are comparing intensities, this can be considered as ratio data. So, is it close to double the sweetness of the sample I tasted previously? So on. Is this color brighter than that one? And you must be able, of course, to express yourself, right? And generally, there would be a minimum level of training required for panelists. So there's there could be outliers, either as in terms of being too precise and in terms of being too all over the place in giving responses, quantifying your responses. So you want to have panelists which have the same level of training and ideally a similar level of capability. Most of these are innate. uh, Training can do only so much to improve you, but how one remembers tastes and quantifies aromas and flavors, for some these are built in based on their genetics and or upbringing. So a super taster versus a non-taster, for example, would have different potentials for analytical testing, but of course that will all depend on how good your brain is at remembering and interpreting, quantifying sensual responses. So, of course, integrity is given here. We must be honest about what we feel about the products. Let's say if you're discussing for descriptive testing about what you find, you can't feign that you um, tasted something that you didn't really taste. You must not have a bias towards the product, like I'm gonna screw up this evaluation by giving false responses because I don't like the product made by this company or how this company makes treats their employees. And of course, when there is a certain level of confidentiality needed, you must adhere to whatever that is. So if you leave the testing room, you should not communicate um, your responses to those who will be entering. This is especially true even for tests like, let's say, consumer tests. Okay, so you must not give undue bias to other people who have not yet evaluated the product. So when you're doing analytical tests, it's best to be familiar with the product so that you have something to start with. If it's a product that you're entirely unfamiliar with, like let's say a foreign food or a fruit that you've never tasted before, then it would be much harder for you to level off with the others So usually when we have descriptive testing, we start by giving descriptors for the products, and so you need to have a wide vocabulary, but you should also be able to express yourself, like you know how it tastes, but how will you describe it to another person? And usually that also comes with experience. So again, when we're looking at untrained panelists, these are your consumers. Again, first level of screening would be if they fit the demographic criteria which we have set in terms of our objectives of the test. So that encompasses all of these. And then you may or may not want previous use of the product. Of course, if it's a new product, entirely new product category, then this won't apply. And their willingness to participate and availability, because sensory evaluation is time bound. There's a date and time for which you must participate, because the food will not be waiting for you. So you must be available at those times.